Vince here to talk about the study that you published last year in PLOS One, where not placebo-controlled, but pretty rigorous, where you tracked the experiences of nearly 100 microdosers for, I think, about a month and a half or so. I'm curious, how did your results from that square with what David just said about the general state of the field?
This study that we ran was a fairly broad study. We had quite a number of different measures that we were investigating with microdoses, and we were looking both at the sort of immediate daily changes on days that people microdosed, and then also longer term changes. We tracked people for a period of about 6 weeks, and we wanted to see if there was any change from baseline to the end of the study on quite a battery of different psychological and cognitive measures. This study was published in 2019 actually, and we collected data for it in 2017 and 2018, so a few years ago now. This was, I guess, the early stages of research with microdosing. And one of the main sort of motivations for this study was to try and see if we could work out what was going on with the reported effects that people were claiming about microdosing in terms of their beliefs and expectations. So as well as tracking what happened with microdoses, we also asked people about their expectations of what they thought microdosing would lead to. And this was sort of, it wasn't as rigorous as having a proper placebo control, but it was our way of trying to identify the role of expectation in some way. And so we found, firstly, that there were some quite interesting changes reported amongst the people who microdosed. They reported reductions in depression, reductions in stress, reduced mind wandering, and increase in something called absorption, which is like someone's internal attentive capacities. And we also found a small increase in neuroticism, which was a little bit surprising and a little bit inconsistent with some of the high-dose psychedelic research. So it's quite a curious combination of different effects that we found. But perhaps even more interesting was that we looked, as I said, at people's expectations and tried to see how these findings squared with what people were expecting to happen. And we certainly found that people had very strong expectations about what microdosing would do. People basically thought that microdosing was going to increase all of the positive psychological variables and decrease all of the negative psychological variables. And so in some ways, it does seem like what people believe could be having quite a strong influence on what they then report. But interestingly, we found that the things that people most expected were not what the microdoses actually reported. So, for example, people most expected increases in creativity, increases in mindfulness, and they weren't actually effects that we found in our study. The people didn't really have strong expectations around the absorption or mind wandering that we did find, and so that made me, reasonably optimistic about the possibility that microdosing is having some kind of pharmacological effect here, or some effect beyond placebo. So I think there's definitely expectations and placebo-like effects at play, and I think some of David's more recent research really speaks to that more clearly. But it does seem like there are potentially perhaps some subtle changes that microdosing is influencing that could be of interest and worth pursuing further.